By the early 1990s, the five and dime store had effectively ceased to exist as a meaningful presence in American retail life. The last of the great chains either closed their doors or converted into something else entirely, a different format, a different name, a different logic. The variety store that had anchored downtown commercial strips in thousands of American towns for nearly a century was gone, replaced first by the discount chains that had learned from its model and then surpassed it, and later by the big box retailers that made the discount chains themselves look small. The ending was not dramatic. There were no mass closures on a single day, no public mourning, no moment when the country collectively registered the loss. The five and dime simply became less relevant year by year until the stores that remained were outnumbered by the memories of the ones that had already closed. But if you grew up going to one, if you know the particular smell of those stores, the particular sound of the floors, the particular feeling of having $1 in your pocket and an entire counter of possibilities in front of you, then you know the story was never really about retail. It was about a kind of place that no longer exists and what it meant to the towns that had one on every main street. The five and dime had its origins in the late 19th century, built on a retail concept so simple it was almost philosophical. Everything in the store would cost either 5 cents or 10 cents. No more. The price was the promise, and the promise was legibility. You didn't need to comparison shop or calculate or wonder if you were getting a fair deal. The price was on the sign above the door. What that constraint produced over decades of refinement was a particular kind of store, wide, shallow in its individual categories, stocked with an enormous variety of small goods that almost anyone might need on any given day. Thread and buttons, hairpins and hand mirrors, candy sold by the piece from glass jars behind a counter, tin toys and rubber balls, sheet music, potted plants, canaries in cages near the front window, their song audible from the sidewalk outside. The stores were not elegant. They were not trying to be. They were trying to be useful to as many people as possible, as cheaply as possible. And they succeeded at that with a consistency that made them as reliable a feature of American towns as the post office or the barbershop. By the time most people who remember them were old enough to go in on their own, the strict nickel and dime pricing had long since given way to a broader range of prices. Though the spirit of the thing had not changed. The goods were inexpensive and varied and displayed in a way that rewarded browsing. You walked the aisles without a list, or with a list you abandoned within the first 2 minutes because something on the counter caught your attention. The counters themselves were a feature worth remembering. Long glass cases ran the length of certain aisles, lit from inside, showing the merchandise beneath without allowing you to touch it until a clerk reached in and handed it across. The clerks knew where everything was. They had to. The store carried hundreds of distinct items in some departments, and a customer asking for a particular size of snap fastener or a specific color of embroidery floss expected an answer, not a shrug. That knowledge was part of the job, accumulated over time, and the clerks who had worked the same counter for years carried it the way any skilled worker carries the specifics of their trade. The lunch counter, where it existed, was the social center of the store and one of the most democratic spaces in any American town. You sat down without a reservation, ordered from a short menu at prices that matched the rest of the store's philosophy, and were served within minutes. A grilled cheese and a Coke for under 50 cents through most of the 1950s. Pie for a dime. Coffee refilled without being asked. The person next to you might be a factory worker on a lunch break, or a lawyer killing 20 minutes between appointments, or a grandmother treating her grandchildren to something sweet on a Saturday afternoon. The counter made no distinctions that the price list didn't make, which meant it made almost none at all. That quality was not celebrated at the time because it was not remarkable at the time. It was simply what the counter was. Its democratic texture only became visible in retrospect, once the counter was gone and there was nothing that worked quite the same way to take its place. The forces that dismantled the five and dime built slowly through the 1950s and then accelerated through the 1960s and 1970s with a momentum that the variety store chains could not match. The first and most consequential was the suburban migration. The five and dime had been designed for foot traffic, for the customer who was already downtown and ducked in as part of an errand circuit that included the bank, the post office, the hardware store, and the pharmacy. When American families began moving into new residential developments built around the automobile, that errand circuit dissolved. People were no longer walking past the five and dime on their way to somewhere else. They were driving to specific destinations, and the destinations were increasingly located in the new shopping centers being built along arterial roads on the edges of towns rather than on the main streets at their centers. The five and dime chains responded by opening locations in the new shopping centers, and some of those locations did well. But the format that had evolved for downtown pedestrian traffic didn't translate perfectly to a suburban context where the car had changed the rhythm of the shopping trip entirely. The discount retailer was a more direct threat, and it arrived in force through the early 1960s. The variety store's competitive advantage had always been price, but the discount chains undercut that advantage by applying the same logic at a larger scale. A single discount store could carry more inventory in more categories at lower prices than any five and dime, because its size gave it purchasing leverage that the variety stores couldn't match. The first discount operations opened in converted mills and warehouses, bare-bones environments with goods piled on tables and no particular attention paid to display or atmosphere. What they offered was price, and price was what the five and dime had always offered. Customers who would have spent an hour browsing the counters of a variety store found themselves redirected to a discount operation that had the same goods for less money in a format that was less pleasant but more economical. The five and dime chains watched their customer base erode through the 1960s and tried various responses, expanding their own discount operations, rebranding, restructuring. But the structural disadvantage was not one that rebranding could address. They were too small to buy as cheaply as the discounters and too large to offer the intimacy and expertise of a genuinely local store. By the early 1980s, the major variety store chains that had not already converted into discount operations were in visible decline. Store counts were contracting. The downtown locations that had been the foundation of the business were closing as the commercial districts around them hollowed out. The shopping center locations that had been opened to follow the suburban migration were competing directly against discount retailers that were larger, better capitalized, and continuing to grow. The lunch counters, which had required skilled staff and held prices that hadn't kept pace with the cost of running them, were among the first things to go in the stores that were trying to cut costs and survive. When the counters came out, something left the stores that was harder to name than a menu item or a revenue line. The reason to linger was gone. The stores became places to pass through rather than places to be, and once that happened, the remaining advantage they held over a discount competitor, familiarity, community feeling, the accumulated texture of a place people had been going for years, began to fade as well. What the five and dime had provided, at its best, was a place where the ordinary transactions of daily life happened at a human scale. The store was large enough to carry what you needed, and small enough that the people who worked there knew what they had and where it was. The prices were low enough that almost anyone could afford to be a regular customer, and the format was open enough that being a regular customer meant something. You were recognized, you were served by someone who remembered what you usually bought, you were part of a daily rhythm that the store helped organize. That scale of relationship between a retail environment and the community it served was not unique to the five and dime, but the variety store practiced it across more categories and more price points than almost any other format that came before or after. When the format died, that scale of relationship died with it. The stores that replaced the five and dime were better at almost every measurable thing: more inventory, lower prices, longer hours, greater convenience. What they were not better at was being a place. The five and dime had been a place, in the way that a town square is a place, in the way that a particular corner at a particular intersection becomes, over enough years and enough ordinary mornings, something more than the sum of its physical dimensions. That is the thing that doesn't transfer when the format changes. It accumulates, and then it ends, and the accumulation is what you miss. If you remember a specific store, which town, which street, which counter, what you spent your allowance on when you were 10 years old, leave a comment. That record is worth keeping. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring these questions, and like the video if it brought something specific back to you. The five and dime is gone, but the shape it left in American daily life is still there if you know where to look for it.